actually to take stock of what planning with nature practices we can look at in different cities, looking both at the local level, landscape level, and regional level as well in peri-urban areas. And we will take stock of what we can see from the city of Lisbon and Malmö, and also from other sectors, and get sectoral perspectives on what we call ecological planning and nature positive planning practices, and also take a look into the future, how we can actually step up action and upscale and mainstream nature-based solutions more in urban contexts and beyond. My name is Bettina Wilk. I work for ICLEI Europe, which is a city network, and I work there as a senior officer for nature-based solutions, biodiversity, and green infrastructure. I work on several Horizon 2020 projects related to nature-based solutions, and I'm also coordinating one of them, which is called Network Nature. It's kind of this umbrella project that brings resources, tools, and knowledge from all the other Horizon 2020 projects that focus on nature-based solutions together. And it also has the aim to disseminate the knowledge that comes out of that and then emerges from that, and disseminate it to a wider target audience. And that's exactly what we actually do today. We're going to start our dialogue from different sectoral perspectives. We have quite a varied panel today, ranging from landscape architects to environmental engineers, but also urban planners and landscape architects. And we will take a look of how we can actually make integrated action work at a city level, and that kind of action that looks both at biodiversity gains, but also at strengthening resilience from a climate adaptation and climate resilience perspective. Since we all know we are now, right at the moment, not only facing a climate crisis, but also a biodiversity crisis, and we cannot tackle them in isolation. Quite the opposite, actually, they exacerbate each other, and we need to look at options and how we can tackle both of them. And that is supposed to be embedded and mainstreamed across different sectors, starting with urban planning. So nature-based solutions per se are integral in nature, so they have this potential to tackle different challenges, environmental, social, and economic ones. They provide several what we call co-benefits, both in terms of quality of life, in terms of cooling down cities, but also in terms of creating retention areas for water, water runoff catch-off. So they have really the ability to tackle different challenges and also different functions, and they're therefore very well suited actually to address this action actually in an integrated manner. So let me now turn to our panelists, and I would like to start introducing them. We have got one panelist that will be joining us online. I don't know if Fernando is there. Okay, good. Can you maybe put him on the screen as well? Hi, Fernando. Good to see you. Glad you made it.
Yes.
Okay. First panelist joining us from Lisbon. Fernando is Senior Advisor at the City Council of Lisbon. He's also coordinator of the local biodiversity action plan in Lisbon. Before that, he was head of division of projects of environment and green spaces, and also responsible of the sector of isolated trees in Lisbon. His background is in both landscape architecture as well as forestry engineering, and he holds a master in urban and regional planning. He also is the focal point of a LIFE project, that is a preliminary LIFE project on urban greening plans, and he's actively involved in another LIFE project that is called LIFE Lungs, that looks at creating resilient and also biodiverse cities. He's also the president of the Portuguese Society for Promotion of Environmental Ecotourism and Education. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Fernando. On to our second city representative, Per-Arne Nielsen, joining us from Malmö here today. Per-Arne is a senior environmental strategist at the city of Malmö, and he has a background in environmental science. He has a long-term experience actually on local work here in Malmö, and also on international cooperation in sustainable development. And he is also the city's coordinator of the Agenda 21. Thanks a lot for joining us today, Per-Arne. On to Johan Folkesson, also joining us from Sweden here today. Johan works for the International Federation of Landscape Architects, And he obviously has a background in landscape architecture. He's president of the landscape architecture chapter of Swedish Architects, representing Sweden in the International Federation of Landscape Architects. He's also head architect of the Swedish Transport Administration, where he's responsible for planning, building, and the maintenance of all state-owned roads and railroads, but also sea and air transport in Sweden. Thanks a lot for joining us. And going on to our only female panelist, I have to say this is not intentional, but this is more like coincidence. So in case there is some criticism coming up here, no.
Yeah.
Monica, it's good to have you. Monica Altamirano is a public-private partnership lead and specialist at Now Partners in Delft, working in the Netherlands. She's got a PhD in economics of infrastructure, where she is specialized specifically on public-private partnerships in the road sector. She has got 18 years of global experience in public-private partnerships, has advised governments worldwide on how to catalyze private sector investments into infrastructure, water, and climate adaptation. And with her work, she actually aims to transition to a restorative economy that also benefits financially and is feasible for developing countries. She's further chair of the Water and Natural Infrastructure chapter at WAPPP. She's member of the World Economic Forum Infrastructure 4.2 initiative and 4.0 initiative, sorry. There's a lot of things you're doing. And of the OECD Roundtable on Financing Water. Last but not least, Jure de Vries. Jure de Vries is Senior Advisor Coast and Estuaries at the Executive Agency of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, also in the Netherlands. Thanks as well for joining us today. He works on system knowledge development in the Dutch Waddenzee. That means that he links new knowledge to existing management and maintenance questions. He is at the moment involved in a research project that focuses on upscaling and mainstreaming NBS in coastal regions. He's got a background in earth sciences and physical geography and a PhD in physical oceanography. Previously, he worked for Van Oord as environmental engineer, where he also led EcoShape's work on building with nature, and he created some guidelines there. And he also co-led a systems chapter in International Natural and Nature-Based Feature Handbook. So let me now turn to our city representatives here. We've prepared some intro presentations to give you a bit of a glimpse of what is happening both in Lisbon and in Malmö in terms of planning with nature and what approaches are being taken, but also what the challenges and enablers are that are found on the way. And I would like to give the floor to Per-Arne first.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Per-Arne Nilsson, as the presenter said, and I try to give a holistic approach to the development of Malmö, connected to nature-based solutions and a sustainable development in the future. And to start with, if you look at Malmö in a little bit bigger perspective, it's a city today that or has always been a city next to the sea, to Öresund, that is a very rich sea area that connects the North Sea and the Baltic Sea. The first reason for Malmö to be was that it was very rich fishing in this in Malmö. We had a lot of herring, and that was the first development boom for Malmö. We was also one important Danish city from the beginning. We've been Danish longer than we've been Swedish. So in a regional perspective, we was harbor city in Denmark, also very rich farmland around Malmö that is a very important resource as well. If we look at a little bit closer on Malmö today, this is from the comprehensive plan in the city of Malmö. You can see that actually more than half of the area of the city is still sea. So that's, of course, important nature resource today as well. The light green parts of it is farmland, some of the most fertile farmland in Sweden and Northern Europe. And the city is squeezed in between. You can also see the old coastline, for example, that we have expanded out in the sea, and especially that was because of industrial development and harbor development. If we then go into the more modern history, this was what this area where we are today looked like in 50 years ago. Malmö was an industrial city. The largest industry in the city was the big shipyard Kockums, and this is from the Kockums area. In the 60s, Malmö was a very successful city. We have 3 kronas lower income tax in local income tax than the average in Sweden, for example. Everyone that wanted to have a job could get a job. We have a booming industry, not only in the shipyard, but also in other parts. What happened to Malmö was that the city was growing and people got more wealth and more money, but when they could afford, they moved out from the city. Urban sprawl, or as we call it in Sweden, the green wave. People didn't want to live in this rather noisy and polluted cities with a lot of activities and not that good living condition if you have. So if you could afford, you moved from apartments in the city out to the surrounding municipalities. After that, we had industrial crisis where a lot of the industry in Malmö have to they were closed, and we had unemployment. Because we are the gate to Europe. We also have got a lot of new people coming from Malmö, and a lot of them stayed in the city. We have a lot of immigrants coming here. So that makes the situation that from being one of the richest municipalities in Sweden, we were bankrupt almost in the beginning of the 90s. And that started a new kind of development in Malmö that is representing of this picture. That's also from the Western Harbor where the shipyard it's on the other side here. The strategy for the city was to, of course, build a bridge to Copenhagen was important. We were connected to Europe, but also have a new kind of urban development where people that moved out from Malmö in the green wave could come back to a greener and better city where they could have they could take a swim in the sea and they could have good conditions for living. So that's a bit still of the strategy for Malmö to be a green, dense, attractive city. A lot of culture, new university, new kind of development. But then, of course, we have other challenges as well. Malmö is now, we are Sweden's 3rd largest city. We are fast growing, and as I said, we have a very mixed population. We, of course, have a lot of challenges, integration challenges, and we have some very poor areas with a lot of problems, but we also have very good conditions and is attractive city in many ways. And I think the attractiveness, the nature-based solution is an important part of the attractiveness also, to include nature-based solutions into the city development. One of the challenges we have, of course, we are very lowland, and when we have storms, it could look like this. This is also just behind here. That was a storm like 5 years ago, I think, that came in and almost flooded our metro system. It was just a couple of centimeters before it had flooded our metro. We also have this kind of situations in the city. We had a heavy rain 10 years ago that flooded a lot and make a lot of damage in the city. To meet these challenges, we have tried to find new ways and work a lot with innovations for almost fall down. Yeah. Innovations for developing the city, and this is one example that you could look at in the afternoon on one of the tours, Augustenborg, where we try to implement blue-green solutions and a sustainable urban drainage system. This area used to be one of the most flooded areas when we have hard rains. Now it's the most resilient area, I should say, for heavy rains in the city. So that's one of the examples. Also this, how to make a city attractive and how to use the city. This is another example from we have a lot of outdoor gyms nowadays. People could go to gym outside. More and more we see examples on people want to work outside, for example. So we have had a project with the university on how to work outside and use the public spaces and make the public spaces also more interesting and more attractive for people to use. We can see also that we have people interested in bird watching, for example. They have better bird watching into the city than outside the city. So it's more and more popular to look at the nature in the city as well. And we have, of course, also more nature reserves and things like that in the city. In the old limestone quarry, for example, is a nature reserve. This, I should say, is one of two of the most important systems in the city. One of them is the blue mussels. We have billions of them out in the sea in Malmö. They did a measurement on the Öresund bridge some years ago and could see that there were 135,000 mussels. I think this is from the Öresund bridge. So actually the bridge, Öresund bridge, is a bit of a biofilter filtering the seawater. So we have quite good conditions in the seawater in Malmö. The other one is eelgrass, that also is a very important thing in Öresund. And this is from the inner part of the harbor area where we try to make it possible for this kind of biodiversity. So I think it's to come to the conclusion that it's important, if you're looking at ecosystem services, also to connect them maybe with the socioeconomic development of cities and how they could be a part of a better development for cities. Because we can see now after Corona that there are some, maybe we will have a new green wave. There will be more urban sprawl. But in the end, I think it's better for the planet and for the world that maybe more people is living in city areas with good conditions and where you can implement an nature-based solution into the city. So that was my presentation. This is the green-spotted cod. That is one of the rare species in Malmö that we take care of as well. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Per-Arne. Really quite impressive work that you're doing, and also an interesting example actually how grey infrastructure can actually more or less accidentally or not so accidentally also lead to the creation of new habitats actually. It's a bit of a different way of looking at it as well.
Yes, and
Yeah,
I think that's a learning also that it's possible to get nature into urbanized areas and when you're doing new buildings. We have good example of green roofs, for example, and other things. Nature doesn't have to be excluded from urban development. It could be included in many ways.
exactly, exactly. Thanks a lot for that presentation. I would now like to hand over to Fernando to give us a glimpse of what Lisbon is doing in terms of nature positive planning and also the challenges that you actually have experienced while implementing them. Over to you, Fernando.
Thank you for the invitation. And I think you are going to see now my PowerPoint. So I'm going to wait a little bit that it is shown. Is it? I can't see it, but I hope you see it. Is it?
Yes, we can see you.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to speaking about 4 points. I thought that once we don't have much time to speak, I'm going to emphasize on four points. And I will let you, if you have any doubts or if you want to deepen any purpose or any subject, of course afterwards you can ask and I can go a little bit deeper on each of the subjects I'm going to point out. The first thing I would like to speak about is about the quality of the environment in the city. And the quality of the environment of the city nowadays is the result of the work being done for let's say 1 century before. Let's say that the city, Lisbon itself, it's quite little, although the city megalopolis is already quite big. So I'm talking to you about one metropolitan area of about 2 million inhabitants. In spite the city where I work, which is the city of Lisbon, is only 580,000 inhabitants. So it's not a big area. And of course, this also means that if we want to work with environment subjects, the environmental subjects don't have borders, which are administrative, and so we need to work with the other cities around. So one of the things that Lisbon has a really important state is that we have a very good quality of the environment. In the beginning, we had it because most of the people came from out of the city, from the rural areas, and they brought their own experience about having their small orchards or their small places where they could have a small agriculture. Let's say it's just an agriculture for fun, but it was providing the city with a good quality of environment. And this was quite important. Afterwards, during the 20th century, we begin to build a big park, which is the park where I work now, which is the Monsanto Park. And this park is about 1,000 hectares. So it's about 1/9 of the whole area of the city. And if you know that Lisbon is surrounded by the river Tagus from one border, and in the other border you have this big park, you can guess that, for example, the good indicators of quality of the environment for the city, generally they are very good. For example, we have a very small, in terms of deepness, a small island of heat. And this means that the whole city has green areas which are enough to provide the city with a buffer that can hide the pollution coming from, for example, from the cars or the eatings and so on. So beginning with this first point, this part, and I would ask for the next slide. I hope it is the first one, because I'm not seeing the picture, but I hope you see it. And in this first slide, I'm talking to you about this park, this Monsanto park. And this is something really important because usually the man is taken as somebody who damages nature. And in this experience, we have restored an ecosystem which was lost for about 400 years. And this ecosystem was restored in only 86 years. Nowadays, the people who visit this, they think it's a natural park. So can help nature rebuilding, restoring the ecosystems. And of course, this were using techniques of NBS, although the term, the word NBS was not yet invented by those times. So we firstly introduced the trees, which are, let's say, the foreground of the forest, and then we monitored and managed these trees for them to grow. And then we began to see that there was a response from the ecosystem, both with the enrichment with other plants but trees, and with other animals. So this monitoring, let's say, led us to act to promote biodiversity. And this biodiversity was promoted mostly by trying to avoid the limiting factors for each of the animals or the groups of animals which we were working with or studying by that time. So we managed the habitat to supply with all the needs that the animals were having. And when we are speaking about animals, we cannot deal only with physiological needs. We are also leading with ecological needs. So questions like shelters, questions like water supplying, questions like tranquility were really important in terms of providing the ecosystem with the characteristics which would lead to the promotion of the more and more biodiversity. I could share just an example, that in Monsanto Park, we never introduced a mushroom. And nowadays we have more than 105 different species of mushrooms in the park. And of course, the ecosystem changed from a really desert, from a really overgrazed and overexploited agriculture fields to nowadays a forest which is already being introduced. So this monitorization is dealt as a whole. It's a holistic approach, it's an ecosystemic approach. When we are dealing with this, and I ask for the next slide, which is the number 2, of course, we are working a lot with the elected people. We are city council, and the city councillors are elected, and they are elected by cycle. So one of the issues we have to take care is about how can we, let's say, ask for the commitment of the political leaders to develop this ecosystem, to provide the city with a better quality of forests and a better quality of biodiversity in the city. Let's say that we need to have them aware. And what we work with is not to get political leaders aware about ecological issues, but to aware everybody. If everybody is aware, they are going to get aware also to the politicians. This awareness which reaches the politicians is the best pressure group that we can have. So let's understand that when we are working with the need of investment to make environmental awareness to general population, is this general population that is going to influence the elected people in order to provide us with the means to develop more and more. So when we ask what is coming first, I think both things come at a time. And we really can be a little joyful because most of the elected people are really people who are aware with the need of the biodiversity. we also worked for the certification of Forestry Stewardship Council, and this was really important because this obliged us to make public consultation. And this public consultation, which before this certification was informal, from that certification on, began to be periodic. Of course, we can say that when we are asking for the opinion of the general public about the way we manage the forests or we manage the green areas, many times we don't have as much answers as we wished. But this doesn't mean that the public is not attentive to our work, which is important. And I could give you some examples, like, for example, rebuilding trails. The people begin to comply and begin to say, and in 5 days you can have 1,000 posts in a Facebook page just because you are dealing with new trails. So this is a good example that no answers usually don't mean that the public is not attentive, but only mean that we are doing a good work, and so the general public usually don't have anything to comply or to say about. Most of the people comply, they say no, and they are not used to say yes and to say well done. And this is a question, a little bit a cultural effect. Passing to the third slide, I would say that one thing which is important is the question of the greening of the master plans and the greening of the general plans in the city. Of course, if there is a pressure, each new building can have an obligation to build a green area. But this is not a rule. So this is not steady. And so what we need is to have good master plans. And I could say that as an example, in 1948, we have had a first Lisbon City's master plan. And in this master plan, we already introduced some green belts. In 1988, the Lisbon Master Plan already included an ecological map, which had the humid and the dry areas, and a plan for the defense of the belvederes. The city is quite irregular, and so in this irregularity, there are many belvederes which open very beautiful views into the city. So we tried to develop a plan which didn't allow to build buildings that would cut these points of view. So this was something very important. And in nowadays plan, which was approved in 2010, we already have a blue and a green infrastructure integrated in the city master plan. We are now acting both to manage the water and the river shores, and the gardens and the parks, and we are trying to improve, for example, this local action plan for biodiversity in Lisbon, which was now enlarged to 2022, and this is something which is really important in terms of the way the city is managed. And of course, we are working a lot in terms of environmental education for a sustainable development. In the fourth point, I know I'm a little bit long, but we could say that the future will be the introduction of the scope of the urban metabolism into the metropolitan area of Lisbon. And this is also a constraint, a barrier, but it is also a challenge for the future. And so one of the problems is, for example, the different personalities as mayors, which improve difficulties in dialogue. And we have a problem which is we don't have a metropolitan management organization It is like a volunteer-based, so each city council can or cannot, want or want not to get into this metropolitan planning structure. So we need to have this approach, and we need to go a little bit deeper in terms of the green and the blue and the brown plans to avoid a little bit the hierarchy which was given both to the black and the green plan. I hope I didn't take too long, but I know like I did overpass my time. So I am ready for your answers, ready for your questions, okay? Good.
Thank you, Fernando. Unfortunately, we could not understand you so well, so I hope that our online audience didn't have too many difficulties listening into this. I tried to grab the main messages, though, and I hope you were able to do so as well. Thanks a lot for giving us an introduction of that very interesting approach. Again, man as the builder of nature, basically like constructing a natural ecosystem from scratch, but artificially in a way, over such a long duration of time. Really impressive work that you're doing. I would now like to open up for reflections from our panelists. As I stated before, it's the strength of this session is actually to have different sectoral perspectives here that we would like to obviously hear as well. So maybe let's start with Johan from the perspective of landscape architects. So by definition, actually, landscape architects are the ones that are responsible for design, management of urban and built-up spaces, and also that includes environmental spaces. So you're very close to influencing actually how spaces are designed, how they are built, and how they are managed actually. So that would lend them itself very much to biodiversity positive planning and design. To what extent do you think is that something that is already being considered in your field, based on your experience that you have from Sweden, and as well from your experience in the transport sector specifically? So where do we stand?
Thank you. Yes, sometimes I refer to the profession landscape architect or working with landscape architecture as some kind of magic that you make high value of something with no or very sparse resource. And I base this on proof of former projects or the work of landscape architects that made an impact into our profession and also made an impact on how we plan cities and how we design cities. And for instance, I'm referring to how we in the 60s first heard about the Silent Spring and how that movement really made an impact on landscape architects, and then all these nature-based solution came up in the 70s with Ian McHarg designing with nature, for instance, and I would say that today I think we are standing in front of a second Silent Spring with other issues and problems, and from a landscape architecture profession point of view, I think the profession is definitely ready to tackle these new issues. Should it be green infrastructure approaches that we heard of today, or how to mitigate urban heat, for instance, and yeah, when it comes to global perspectives, I think it's always also worth to mention food production. Per-Arne showed today that there is actually very good soil here in Malmö, and in a global perspective, a lot of the food production actually is connected to the urban areas, and also when it comes then to climate change issues, I think we are developing tools about how we can calculate the effect of greenhouse emission gases, for instance, and the impact a certain design has. I think, I mean, the profession is multidisciplinary, and I think that reflects on how we can approach those issues, and it's also describes that landscape architecture, in one instance, handles like the planning or the design, like a final result, so to speak, but also that we do this together with other professions. So we're very much trained, and we can handle the processes together with other disciplines that is needed to tackle all these different aspects that needs to be taken care of if we want to go to this higher level of we need to reach a higher level of urban planning and urban design if we want to reach those sustainable development goals that we all agreed on.
Quite right, you are. I was wondering what potential do you see, especially in the role of landscape architects, towards increased adoption of such practices? What is needed most urgently, in your opinion, to move forward and to make it more, let's say, mainstream in your field?
Very good question. I think that what we see now is a need to. I mean, there is an acceptance of nature in cities in a way. We see it during the pandemic. People have started to explore new areas within the urban environments or very close by, which is could be defined as nature. But what I'm concerned about, what I think we need to work with, is that the acceptance of nature is related to these patches of nature where it could be wild, and then there is all these other areas in the cities where there still is as a view on nature that it should be tamed somehow or detained in cages, or so I think we need to come up with ideas and design that makes nature-inspired solution be more accepted in whole parts of the city, not just all these patches like a park or a natural reserves or big water bodies where it's accepted to be wild, but like bring in the wildness in the city.
Thanks a lot for that first reflection from your perspective. Actually, does anyone want to add on? We have heard quite a few barriers, but also enablers in these presentations. One of them was political commitment, for instance, then public awareness raising. Maybe Per Arne, do you have some kind of experience as the coordinator of the Agenda 21? What could work well here? Because in the end, actually, we rely very much on private actors as well to drive action.
Yeah, as I tried to say, that I think that nature-based solution is a key issue also for socio-economic development of cities, because if we want a lot of people to live in cities, we must have good conditions for people, but also for living a good life, and all this nature could help us also to have good air quality and less noise and things like that. I think we have we should have a more win-win-win situation if we develop the possibilities with more nature-based solutions in the future. And I also think that it could be a very in Sweden we have a big discussion nowadays about cement that have a huge climate impact. Could we have other kinds of materials? Could that be connected to more nature-based solutions for develop new kinds of constructions and with new kinds of materials? That's a lot of thinking like that. Then maybe also to add something, if you look at Malmö, for example, we have very wealthy parts of the city, but we also have poverty in some parts of the city. I think the poverty could also be that living in not attractive parts of the city and well, not believing in the future maybe and have a bad condition. So I think it give impact for people how they live and what possibilities they have to live a good life. We must be better to take that in the part when we develop cities, I think.
Exactly. I mean, that's also what is very much covered by nature-based solutions as a very multifaceted approach, actually, and that's the benefit of it. And that's also what is so wonderful about them, actually, that we can tackle different challenges. If it's requirements from society, requirements from nature, actually, in terms of quality of life, disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, but also ecosystem resilience and creating habitats for biodiversity, which actually then again directly underpin human health. So it's all connected in a way. And this is actually the big challenge as well, because when we talk about creating impact at scale, we need to design nature-based solutions as part of a strategically managed and created network of wider green and blue spaces. So we need to create these corridors, make sure that there is connectivity, that there is diversity in species, and that spaces are connected. And in general, we very much favor a systems-based approach. So an approach that actually starts from the logic of resilience building almost, and from the logic of ecosystems that can be also transferred to cities that are then perceived as one interrelated system with different subsystems, be it societal, technical, infrastructure, that all are interdependent in a way, but also rely on each other. The big question, and I think that's the million-dollar question, is how do we make these systems-based approaches work in practice? And actually here I would like to zoom out a little bit now from the city level and onto the landscape and almost catchment level, I would say. Jure, you've got quite some clear ideas. You've worked on how to upscale and actually mainstream nature-based solutions in coastal regions. The approach you're working with is a building with nature approach that is basically making use of nature and natural processes to enhance infrastructure functions and services, which we also call hybrid infrastructure. And you have developed an approach that I find quite interesting. It's about integrated, and I hope I get it right now, integrated system-based asset management approach. And this is also the way towards mainstreaming NBS more in coastal regions and areas. Can you explain a bit more about what this approach is about and how that actually benefits this upscaling?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Bettina. Yeah, so we call it short ISBAM, just so you don't have the trouble with, let's say, the whole name. And ISBAM is basically a way or a framework, conceptual framework, how you can, think more from a system approach, but then also consider the assets that are in there. So usually, it's very interesting for me to be here because I'm come more from the flood safety area. So we really focus on how can we prevent flooding. But you also have to include other co-benefits, of course, and that ISBAM actually includes those different objectives that we have in that system-based asset management approach. And it's basically focused on 6 enablers, we call them. So we consider that we should have an enabling environment, and I think some of those enablers I heard come by already also this morning and also during our discussion here. So one is really the building of nature technology and system knowledge. So you really have to understand the system you're working on. So you need examples, case examples. So if we have a solution of a green roof, or let's say, from my perspective, let's say a flood safety measure. So along the Dutch coast, we use a lot of sand nourishment to protect our coast. Now, how does that work? How reliable is it? Is it safe enough? Those are all things we have to know, and we can only know that by testing that in practice. And when we have that knowledge from a pilot, then we can use that to upscale and apply it to a larger region. There's also and linked to that, that's the adaptive management, maintenance and monitoring. So basically, how does our solution behave in the future? So basically, for building with nature, we define nature-based solutions as being always dynamic, site-specific or context-specific, multifunctional, and innovative. And you see that back in those enablers also. So yeah, it's an MBS solution is dynamic, so we have to be able to monitor it in a good way, and also see how it performs and how do we manage that. Because maintenance, yeah, it's nice when you build something, but who's going to be responsible for the maintenance? Is that someone else? Is that you? Yeah, those are all things to consider. Those are basically the natural system enablers, but of course the social system is just as important. So that's how do you deal with the stakeholders, how do you include all those objectives that are there. And linked to that is also the institutional embedding. So how can you fit that in a regulatory system? How does it fit, or do we have to change regulations? Those are two different discussions also, of course. And then what's the business case? So yeah, how can we fund this project? How can we look at that on a bigger scale also? Who's going to pay for it? And of course, the capacity building. I think I heard that a few times already. That's just very important that we see all those enablers together. I think if we work on all of those, then we can get to that integrated to that ISBAM approach. And we're still thinking about now, how can we best do that? I think what's perhaps easier in a city is that you can develop a master plan because there's, let's say, one municipality responsible. But for, let's say, the whole coastline, it's different. You have different parties that are involved. So how do you get all those people together to develop a vision with clear objectives, what you want to work on? And then how do you actually make that step from vision to practice?
I see.
Hope that explains it a bit.
Thanks a lot. So how do you see this approach actually being realized in cities? Now you look very much at a more like a coastal scale, right? Yeah. Are there possible entry points that you might have now spotted based on the presentations that we heard from Lisbon and Malmö that got you some ideas about how that could be employed in practice?
For city specifically?
Yeah, cities and peri-urban areas.
So once in a while, the first mantra from Building with Nature popped up in my head, and it's basically understand the system. So really think about that site-specific context. I think the master plan, that's pretty clear, but how do we do that then, and also what do we want to create? Because you can have parks separately, or do you want to focus more on the multifunctionality? And what kind of system do you want to create? And I think that will be very different for Malmö or Lisbon, for example. And how does that fit? I think first of all in the natural system, what kind of habitats do you want to create? And is that desirable also for the people living there? Perhaps I find that funny example, but it's also a bit problematic. Is in Limburg, in the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, they reintroduced the beaver a while ago as part of the Natura 2000 network, which is very nice. It's good for biodiversity. But now there are so many that actually they are starting to eat at the dikes. So it's actually a problem for flood safety. So how do you balance those different interests? So I would say understand the system. That's always the starting point, and I think there's always a bit of room to work on that still. Yeah.
Actually, this balancing act is one of the points that I had in mind as well that I wanted to ask, possibly to Johan, but also to Fernando, if he's still with us, actually. So we always have this, now we have more and more demand for getting nature back into the cities. That leaves us with a lot of different requirements, actually, of functions that the cities that are already quite dense have to fulfill. So that is quality of life, that is also housing and infrastructure. And then obviously we have nature conservation areas, ideally with little or no human intervention. I know this is in cities mostly not possible, but how do we actually balance these different requirements and functions, and what are the ways to do so? Maybe I'm going to ask Johan to give us a quick idea about that, and then after that Fernando to complement.
Yes, thank you. I think it's important to know what kind of value that we are talking about. And I think today we are starting to developing tools to learn how to value all these aspects, so we then can compare to each other. But I think we have to further develop these tools, how to really calculate on the value of health, for instance, the presence of nature in our built environments, or the absence of nature really affects our health, positive or negative, and all these other factors that we have discussed today. They need to be measured somehow, so we then in the next step can compare them to each other and make balanced choices. Because what we see today is that once again we see all those patches with good examples, but I can't really see that we have that the standard solution is the good solution that really defines how we plan and build our cities, because there are other values that are valued higher most of the time. So I think that is one of the most important answers to that question, that we need to value these aspects and then relate it to other aspects that are more in focus today.
Thank you. Thank you. Fernando, would you like to complement to this also from your perspective in terms of urban planning and the restored park that you were talking about? So how do you balance that out in practice? How does that work out for you?
I've been here for some minutes, so I hope I didn't lost too much. But of course, it should be important, because it's important also. Always. But I think that in the park we are trying to deal with all the subjects that are taken when we consider an ecosystem, both in the park and both with the connections outside. I could say that, for example, when we are talking about the landscape approach, most of the people nowadays, they are not asking for a garden which has beautiful flowers during all the year, but they are asking for a garden which has animals to be possible to be seen during all the year. So we are now planning in a response to the requests of the public. The public requests for this kind of approach, this kind which is a biodiversity approach to the gardens. And in this pandemic times we lived, I think this was even improved. So nowadays we are dealing with more and more, let's say, requests for a large biodiversity inside the city.
Thanks a lot. Fernando, one question. Do you think, or what is the value, and how can actually policies in different shapes and forms actually help to steer that further and to balance these different functions? How do you see that specifically related? You are the coordinator of the local biodiversity action plan, so you have loads of experience actually, I guess, on all these issues. Can policy act as an enabler in that sense? What is your experience?
Yes. Yes, of course, yes. It is an enabler, or it is also a wall if it is against this kind of approach. Because let's say we depend both on funding and both on establishing the rules that are going to deal with all the people in this approach. For example, if we want enterprises to help us, so we need to have an offer for them. Generally, we work a lot in terms of team building activities, for example. And when they come to make their team building activities to the parks, usually they bring their work as volunteers, and they bring also some investments in materials or something which are helpful for the work they are going to be working with. And so this is a way of getting the support from the enterprises. If we are talking with the politicians, of course, we need to have activities which are publicly positive. If the public comes and participates and likes and makes their own okay when asked about what they think about the activity, this is important for the policy makers in order for them to feel they are useful to the general population. And this is, of course, the way we are dealing with, and we are trying to get more and more involvement from the general public and from the elected people, of course.
Thank you, Fernando. That actually brings me to the next topic that I'd like to zoom in. We have less time for that than expected, but this is about finance, since it's such a big topic actually when it comes to investment into nature-based solutions, but also climate adaptation. So what we hear is all the time that there is a gap there's a nature finance gap and there's a climate adaptation finance gap, and how can we close this gap actually? So we're moving away from nature-based solutions actually as a traditional field of implementation and investment by the public sector to opening up more to private sector investment. That's what we call co-finance and blended finance mechanisms that we see more and more being piloted at the very moment, but coming quite strongly. And here I would actually like to have your opinion, Monica. You are a public-private partnership specialist. You have worked a very long time actually with finance and business models, also at a watershed and catchment scale, and how you can actually channel these investment processes into infrastructure planning and investment in the widest sense. The question is, usually we say, well, access to finance is a problem, but actually, and I put this in the room, the problem is not available finance very often, but the lack of well-prepared bankable projects. What is your stance on that, and how do you see that?
Thank you, Bettina. Yeah, I think what you mentioned is indeed where the problem is. I think I've been following like water finance, conservation finance, climate finance, and in every event that there is like we have the money is there, but the good projects are not there, no? And I think it's super hopeful that more and more financing facilities are being set up by different donors, but at the same time, it's a bit depressing that the conclusion they all reach within 2 years is that they don't get enough transformational proposals, no, to use that money. So, yeah, what we have been working on, and actually had the opportunity to apply much more in detail to nature-based solutions through Horizon 2020 project, NIAD, Nature Insurance Value Assessment and Demonstration, and is in a way like rethinking deal origination, right? Normally in the public sector, I think we have made great advances to do strategic planning, master planning. I still think we remain a bit too silos. We do them for water security, we do them for energy security, we do them for food, and there is something to be done there too. But at the same time, then when you go to the finance sector, they are thinking in one deal that is ring fence and is not able to capture no, all these co-benefits that we talk about. So how do we close that kind of valley of death between marvelous strategic plans that look at those synergies and spot while we should invest in nature-based solutions, for example, and the investment planning process, no? So what we have been working on is this approach that basically you could say is like a multi-sectoral approach to investment planning that should happen at the watershed level, because I think not because I have been working for 11 years in the water sector, I've been quite critical about what we do well and maybe not too well, but it has been, I mean, researched a lot that most of the impacts of climate change will be felt through the water cycle. And the watershed is kind of the unit where you make sense of the water cycle. No? So in that sense, when we would look at that unit, and that does require some collaboration between different municipalities, no, or downstream and upstream, we are already tackling a lot of the risks because of climate very early, you know, in that process. The other thing is that it should be kind of a nexus approach to national investment system in which we're able to have the health sector investing in water or the other way around. And where we are able, which we are not that much able right now, to engage private sector early enough in the process, no, and the financial sector in a transparent way. And that's where it always gets tricky, you know. I have making now the shift also to more the private sector, and they don't, when they are being very innovative, they don't want to handle with the government sometimes because they think a new regulation can come up too quick that kills the innovation process, or the public sector feels they could compromise the transparency, you know, with engaging. So I think there are quite a number of techniques that you can use to make sure that this process is transparent and it keeps the level playing field. So basically the process is like, in one way, zooming out. So say if this was documented in this handbook for the implementation of nature-based solutions, where we were developing for people who has ideas on nature-based solutions, right? But normally don't have this feeling of how the national investment cycle, planning cycle happen, or how the finance sector works. So trying to create this kind of shared language in which they would be able to, okay, I have a great idea for these small nature-based solutions here, but how do we zoom out and see that implementation, not just of that side, but nature-based solutions as critical infrastructure networks, would make sense for the economic agenda of that place, right? Because when we're able to speak in the language of the goals and the economic vision that place has in the future, then we're making a very strong strategic case. And we're able to, I mean, we work, for example, with system analysis of system dynamics, causal loop diagrams, those type of graphical methods that is quite easy to see then in a systemic way costs and benefits. And that's the base for blended finance, right? Because there is no way we can make the argument that we need climate finance or health finance in this if you cannot place your your favorite nature-based solutions project in that big scale. And so that's open one way. Then though this kind of synergy and thinking in the future, maybe 10, 15 years ahead of how you can transform the economy through nature-based solutions approach, has to be then going to kind of the more boring details and zooming in the contractual details. Because, you know, I've been working in finance, but actually at the core of it is institutional analysis. Because there is no way a transaction always need a contract, right? So in that process, what we do is we first say, okay, this marvelous plan that everybody is so enthusiastic about, how do we make it manageable having clusters of projects, which could be, I mean, most of the time will be hybrid now. And for those clusters, already also see how much should be the public sector through procurement should push them, or is something that if you set a regulatory framework could be a market, no, like water storm markets in US. And so in that respect, when you get to clusters that you can face in time and so forth, then you start per cluster to go into the details. Where should the funding come from? How do you govern this, no? Do you put it in the market as one deal or separate deals? And then going all the way into the details of, for example, if it's the first, I don't know, wetland recovery project you're doing, you may not maybe be able to go to a public-private partnerships or a concession model. You may have to do the more traditional design build and then maybe a maintenance project. But then when you have planned 5 more wetlands projects in that country, you can think that that learning should be taken into maybe go more performance-based contracts. So basically, it's trying to go in that and creating at the same time this language, because I think the knowledge is there. I mean, I've hung out some hours of my day with public-private partnerships that would tell you everything you need to know about a good performance-based contract, and then you have so much people looking at conservation finance, or ecologists and so forth. But we need, and I think we discussed that earlier, is the skills and the attitude to have really level playing fields where every expertise, also indigenous community expertise, is part of the design process, no? So that's, so yeah, more or less is like multi-sectoral at watershed scale, transparent early private sector investment. That's some of these ingredients. I don't know if this answers your question.
It does.
Okay.
Thanks a lot for this very valuable input, actually. And yeah, actually, it comes down in the end, as I understand it, again, that the co-finance, co-finance arrangements are actually again in core a co-governance arrangement issue again, and institutional embedding. So we come back to these known barriers. I also say in terms of sectoral silos that we unfortunately too often see in that very field and also in other fields. So thanks a lot for that. I would like to leave some time for questions, actually. And I would like to point out to our online audience to please use the Hopin platform, and there you can actually use the questions and answers section to put your questions there. I'm just going to carefully look at Daniela, my colleague,
Yes,
who has kindly been keeping track. Do you have some questions that came in already?
I have a very good question
Very
that links to what you were just talking about here. It comes from Charlotte Steenen. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. So she asks, and it could be to Per or even to Fernando, and if the others also want to comment, I think it's relevant for all actually. It's how should local governments be structured to allow diverse stakeholder collaboration when implementing NBS? Should there be a new department? How can we make stakeholder collaboration mainstream?
Tricky question indeed.
Key question.
Per-Arne, maybe. Yeah?
It's a good question. I think it's a matter of culture, maybe, in both from the political view and also from the people working with these issues in the city, for example, and also from the business sector to be brave and involve people in the processes. Then maybe also it could be a matter of how the people who want to be involved are organized. I think it could be easier on a very local basis when you have an area, for example, in the city where you should do something to involve the very local people in that area.
Actually, at Rijkswaterstaat, we have the stakeholder process as part of the projects themselves. So if we would do a new dike construction or a certain project, or we had a big project room for the rivers in the past, then we would always have several rounds of stakeholder consultation to also involve their needs basically and see what's possible. So that's part of our process. I would not have a different department. I would just try to make it part of the process that you have already.
Yes, please, Johan.
I can add one comment, and it's the policy level and the importance of having a policy, and it could be like everything from the global perspective down to the national perspective, then implemented in the regional perspective and the local perspective, because this is only based on some municipalities in Sweden where the responsibilities for these issues was placed on the people actually working with them, and or placed on the politicians. And in the case where it was put on the people that worked with these issues on the daily basis, there were a lot of internal conflicts, and they couldn't find a way of going forward together. But in the situation where the politicians said that, okay, we need to take responsibility here and put up I mean, it's a political policy, so in a way it's maybe thin or weak, but still it was someone who pointed on all these people responsible. This is a vision, or this is where you should put the bar, so to speak. So and then everybody kind of had that document to work together as a common goal, so to speak. So I would say that the policy from international perspective down to the local perspective is quite important to get all the stakeholders to discuss this on like equal terms.
To be on the same page as well, yeah. Monica, you want to comment?
I'd like to add just a point that I mean, participation is costly for citizens too, no? And especially if you put it in a context of developing countries, is quite costly, because if they attend that meeting and they go to that, but they not attending their primary needs. So I think it is important to realize that, and also avoid stakeholder fatigue, which is happening in many places, no? So in that respect, also you see in places like India, for example, that if you do want to have communities driving this development, you need clear guidelines, like you say. Also, it shouldn't be like, I don't know, but at the same time, it's like do it for all their needs at the same time, right? Because otherwise it comes one project that wants to ask them about water, and then it comes another ask them about something else. So it's just understanding that has an opportunity cost, or either we can cover it, which some projects do it, or we have to organize it more efficiently than we have been doing it until now, is my opinion.
Yes, I would also agree that it's also, when it comes to participation, sometimes there's always this, you know, it's always said, yeah, we need to create participation, but you need to do that in a tailored way as well. So participation is not participation. If you want to engage people, then you might have to engage them in different ways based on their needs and where and how and why they need to come in, not just for the sake of having a participatory process, I think. And that's very much what we have also learned in co-creation processes, that it's not necessarily always the same thing. Fernando, would you like to complement here?
Yes, I would say that it is not important to have a structure defined for this kind of approach between the local government and the stakeholders. I think what is important is to have the guidelines that we were talking about. If the guidelines are correctly established, I already work in both ways, with the structure just defined for finding the sponsoring and so on, and without this structure. And if the guidelines are really well defined, the rules are very well established, we are able to distinguish two different things. One is to value more and more the green labeling. So when we have an enterprise which is financing, or which is dealing with, or which is having a policy which is helpful to the biodiversity or to the quality of the environment or so on, if we value that is something which adds value to the enterprise, and we are going to get more and more sponsors. If we don't do it, or if we don't establish the correct guidelines to distinguish this green labeling to the green washing, we are losing our hope. Because if there is somebody which is just greenwashing and it is included in the green labeled group, this is going to take value to the green labeled, and so they are not going to continue with the cooperation with you. So I think that co-financing and the sponsoring and the help from the stakeholders is really stated on having very good guidelines to this work.
Yes, fully agreed. Actually, there need to be clear guidelines and a clear structure so that it's clear which role does everyone have, what are the responsibilities, where do we go, and to how far do they actually go. so that it's actually also expectation management, I think, and so that it's a strategic process towards creating ownership as well, since that's actually also what we're aiming at, right, when we talk about stakeholder engagement. So we want more buy-in, we actually want the solutions to be more accepted, possibly also to draw in private actors that can help us maintain and manage them, because yeah, that's another financing topic then as well. But with nature-based solutions, we often have this problem that the maintenance process costs a lot as well. So that's not only the upfront costs. Thanks a lot, Fernando. I would like to take, finally, I'm sorry it's coming a bit late, but more questions from our audience here, actually. Does anyone have a question for our panelists?
So I have another one, another online question here. It's anonymous, and the question is, in an urban context, how can you account for the external metabolism of the city? For example, how do you account for the sustainability of food, water used from outside metropolitan boundaries?
I think that might be a question again for Fernando or Per Arne. I don't know who wants to go first.
There are models already established. There is a doctorate made by Thomas Elliott in 2021 in the list, in the Luxembourg Institute of Science and Technology, held by an Italian guy, which has established already models for urban metabolism. And these models have worked with different cities in the world so that you can have different approaches adapted to each of the countries. You have Siena in Italy, you have Lisbon, you have Esch-sur-Alzette in Luxembourg, you have, I can't remember any more. Even though if you just look at these kind of theses, these metabolism models have already been worked, and they have tried to make some acquaintance about the accounts of this urban metabolism. There are also works done by the metropolitan area of Barcelona, which have already led to some quantification of the services provided by the ecosystems that can help you on these accounts.
Thanks a lot. Per Arne, do you want to compliment?
Yes, I think maybe wise and brave decision makers is important all the time, because in the end somebody have to take a decision, and if sometimes it could be politicians, sometimes it could be an expert or something, but you always have to have look outside the box sometimes, not only focus on what is the wise thing to do if you want to have long-term sustainability, for example. So some kind of wisdom, I think.
Yes, Monica, please.
I'd like to add something, is that I think is like when you think on the impact of this, of the people who lives in the city, towards all those other systems that go beyond. It's a combination. Like I think one part is like in water and energy, maybe set by the type of infrastructure systems that you have in one city versus another. They could have a higher footprint, but also others like food is a lot of the consumer choice. So what another person at Now Partners, for example, is behind this global footprint methodology, and probably you saw on the news this global overshoot day. By 21st of July of this year, we already use all the resources that we should have used for a year. And you can go and check as a person, when have you consumed all the resources because of the type of house you live in, the city? And you will see that in most of the cases in developing countries, probably because there are much lower standards also in certain things, they will go to further in the year than maybe in an advanced city. So I think it's like this combination. As cities, you have all those consumers, so you can be powerful in changing behavior in a more concentrated way than in the rural areas. But then, of course, is the question, how do you finance the transition to other infrastructure networks that lower that too? And that's, I think, more challenging in terms of financial resources.
Very good. Thank you, Monica. I would like to give our audience a second chance. Wonderful. Okay, please.
Just sharp question.
No, thank you. And actually, this latest question provoked me to ask my question that I have since a long time, because Per-Allan, you mentioned something that very often comes up in our discussions these days, that the densification of cities and urban areas is good. It's good for the climate, it's good for I don't know what. But there is the rural hinterland, and if we continue this discussion like we are now, I think we will end up being seen as colonializers and exploiters of not even rural areas, but just the countryside. And you know, you said who decides? I think sometimes, like you described in the 1970s, 60s of Malmö, people vote with their feet. So how can we, and maybe Johan, you particularly have been thinking about this, how can we in a more balanced way also include in our discussions about the urban futures, the hinterland, the countryside and its values, both economically, and here you talk to someone who comes from the far north of Sweden, of course. So, but this is a challenge everywhere in the world with the very rapid and very sometimes unhealthy urbanization, because there is no time to do it better. It just grows in itself. So maybe we can finish on this question.
Johan, and then Per-Arne, I would say, or?
Yeah, there is two issues that I start to think about. It's first, it's about the densification of our urban areas and what is a dense city. Sometimes we talk about the Malmö as a dense city, but I would say it's not dense, it's small and compact, but I think Copenhagen, for instance, on the other side of the ocean, is much more dense than in Malmö, and we still have the possibility to densify the city, not losing other qualities, and of course there are some positive aspects of urbanization through densification. But then the other issue about the countryside or the countrysides, because the countryside is in both the national point of view and global point of view very, very diverse, and it's also about the site-specific perspective that different countrysides has different they offer different kinds of development, and there are different kinds of landscapes that attract different kinds of people. So I think you have to be very aware of this relationship between the rural and the urban, and also be very wise when you maybe on a regional or national level plan or contribute to the development of those human habitats, so to speak.
Per-Arne, I would pass on to you.
Yes, but I think we have to think about this, about how do we organize our civilization for one planet living, if we will be more people on the earth as well. And I think that's an important thing, to have this living discussion about the best way of doing it. I don't say that, but I think that maybe we have to have cities because they can. It could be an effective way of many people to live a good life, but we also need, of course, the hinterland and the surroundings but maybe not as urban sprawl where people commuting in by car to the city and maybe some kind of other way of. But I think in a way we have to think more about philosophy, and philosophy is in a way politics in the end as well. So.
Thank you, Per-Arne. I see that we have one last question, I think, for that this time. Mm-hmm.
It's also a response to this discussion. So on the one hand side, we are talking a lot about greening and urban greening as a measure for making cities and inner cities and dense cities more attractive. And one very transformative approach would be think about all the space cars are occupying in cities. How much greening would be possible without cars? This would make cities more attractive and eventually give one less reason for going to live in the countryside. If this is the part or the type of colonization you were thinking about. It's a bit of optimistic and perhaps also blonde and blue-eyed. But it is one argument, and as Per-Arne said, cities have their values, and living in a culture is culturally stimulating environment has other values than living in the countryside. So,
if I think one answer to that question is if you go to the study tour to Sege Park and look at the development of parking house, they are not anymore just parking house. They are mobility hubs where you also could have more functions. You can get your mobility demand satisfied in this. It don't have to be with a car. It could be with something else, a bike or something. But you also could add other functions to this. For example, as an energy hub, a local energy hub, or with green walls and some ecosystem services connect to that. So I think one answer for sustainable cities is more maybe to add more functions into new concepts. Because I can agree that one mistake that was done in the 60s and 70s where they tried to build a good society was that it was like if you build one apartment, you have to build 2 parking plots, and that was parking for free. You don't have to pay something extra. So even if you live in the apartment and didn't have a car, you have to pay for it when it was planned and built. So sometimes this kind of norms when you develop cities could be bad as well. I think we have the parking norm too long in Sweden, for example. We have to think in new ways.
One last comment, because I think we have to close.
No, it's just a comment on this car issue. I think in Sweden we have 8 parking lots on each car, so it's more than in the United States actually, and both this aspect of the parking norm, but also that there is this. I was talking about the value before, and it's very easy to calculate on this on the presence of the car and the parking lot, and this is just one concrete example of what I was talking about. Then we need to also value nature in the city to compare this, that one car takes up 200 square meters in the urban areas. Can we compare this to what we could do with those 200 square meters if we plan and design in another way?
Okay.
Now people in the chat are also engaging. Oh my God, when we're ending, people
just
start.
a quick comment. I saw an exhibition with this man, Hundertwasser. You know about him? He was an artist and also an architect. But he's seen it as a human right to have a tree for everyone. So maybe it should be more a human right to have a tree than having a parking plot, I think.
Yeah,
That is the system was
Yeah.
before.
for sure.
Yeah, I think we have to close now. Actually, what I take away from this is actually we have to brings us back to balancing the different functions and requirements. We need to look at how we construct and reinvent cities in terms of citizens' needs for sure, but also the natural needs. And how can we actually combine functions, for example, through multifunctionality of spaces. And we also need to look at how we can actually connect urban spaces better to peri-urban areas and also to regions, especially in light of biodiversity and climate resilience benefits. And this is actually also my closing remark. I want to thank all panelists for coming here today, including Fernando, who has been joining us online. And thanks also to you for joining us here physically. Wish you a good rest of this conference, and we will be around actually if you still want to discuss something or if there's something that is still burning. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.